Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Chase Rend, and I'm the director of the National Building Museum. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to the museum and to this very special program this evening. I'm also greatly honored to welcome the distinguished individuals who are on tonight's program. I will now invite them up to the stage by their name to take their seats. Each of them will receive a more complete introduction later in the program. Allow me to invite Robert Ivy, Editor-in-Chief of Architectural Record. Charles Correa, an internationally acclaimed architect from Bombay, India. Martin Filler, an architecture critic based in New York City. And our honored guest, His Highness the Aga Khan. Tonight, we will celebrate and explore the many contributions of His Highness the Aga Khan to promote design excellence, urban revitalization, and historic preservation in countries where Muslims have a significant presence. In recognition of his sustained and successful efforts to improve the built environment in the Islamic world, the museum organized a gala ceremony last night to present His Highness with our highest award, the Vincent Scully Prize. Established in 1999, this prize is named after the illustrious and influential Yale University professor, Vincent Scully. The prize recognizes exemplary practice, scholarship, or criticism in architecture, landscape design, historic preservation, planning, or urban design. Previous recipients are Vincent Scully himself, Jane Jacobs, Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, and Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. As you will learn over the next hour and a half, His Highness the Aga Khan also richly deserves this prize. The museum is deeply honored that he has accepted it. And now, I am delighted to inform you that Professor Scully is here with us this evening. He now will pay a brief tribute to His Highness. Vincent?
Thank you very much, Your Highness, ladies and gentlemen. I met His Highness the Aga Khan for the first time last night, and though I've known his work and admired it for a long time, it was only last night that I came to realize what a kind and gentle man he is. So that this is a especially happy occasion for me. His Highness the Aga Khan honors this prize by accepting it, and further ennobles the cause of architecture, which he has already served so well. Architecture itself is a mediating art. It mediates between humankind and nature's implacable laws, and it shapes the communities in which we live together. The awards, so generously conceived and supported by the Aga Khan, do much the same thing. They encourage architecture and city building at their best to mediate between the cultures of East and West, bringing the most beautiful buildings and the most humane urbanism of contemporary Islam forcibly to Western consciousness and admiration. They, and everything they stand for, shine as bright lights in a darkening world. They embody the hope of well-intentioned people everywhere, for civilization itself, for mutual understanding, decent brotherhood, and peace. For this, the Aga Khan deserves our profoundest gratitude. And we take this occasion to thank him and to assure him that we share his faith in architecture's grand and healing role.
Thank you, Professor Scully, for those insightful observations about the contributions made by His Highness to the improving the built environment. And coming from the person for whom the prize is named, they carry very special meaning. This year, the National Building Museum is celebrating its 25th anniversary. And what better way to start our celebration than to have His Highness with us tonight? According to the Act of Congress that established the museum in 1980 as a private nonprofit institution, our mission is to present exhibitions and education programs interpreting all aspects of the world that we build for ourselves. Today, we are recognized as America's premier cultural institution examining architecture, planning, engineering, and construction. And now a word of explanation about tonight's program. First, there will be a short video that focuses on the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. And speaking of this award, the world's largest such prize, I should inform you that our museum shop, which is located right over there, has specially obtained advance copies of an informative book about the current Aga Khan Award winners and stories about His Highness's views on architecture. And you may obtain copies of this book after the program. Following the video, His Highness and then Charles Correa will give brief remarks. They will then engage in an extended dialogue with Martin Filler and Robert Ivy. The museum is extremely grateful to Messrs. Correa, Filler, and Ivy for agreeing to participate in this program. And we have very special thanks, especially to Charles Correa, who has come all the way from Bombay, India, just for this program. Robert Ivy has graciously agreed to moderate tonight's program. He is an architect in his own right, as well as a highly respected writer and editor. As I already mentioned, he is editor-in-chief of Architectural Record. In early 2002, he published an extended interview with His Highness in Architectural Record. Since he assumed leadership of this periodical several years ago, it has grown to become the world's largest professional architecture magazine. In 2003, it earned publishing's highest honor, the National Magazine Award for General Excellence. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Robert Ivy to the podium. Thank you, Robert.
Good evening. Mr. Rand, Your Highness, fellow panelists and guests tonight. What a splendid occasion and what a splendid space we find ourselves in. We're gathered I think in an unusual occasion to celebrate a man whom we collectively admire, His Highness the Aga Khan. And congratulations, Your Highness, on your recent honor, the Scully Prize, and what a wonderful moment to have Mr. Scully here with us. Tonight, for all of our admiration, however, we share a unique opportunity to engage His Highness in a frank discussion, building on the work that he has done over these years and examining that work and the programs that surround it. While his own religious community is Islamic, residing on 4 continents, what relevance might the programs that he has established have for our own countries, cultures, for our own communities? What meaning can we draw from it? I have had the privilege, as Mr. Wren mentioned, of interviewing His Highness at his headquarters at Aigues-le-Mont outside Paris, and I can tell you that you're in for a treat because he is frank and open and intelligent in a way that I think will astound you. A component of this evening is exploratory and some is didactic. All of us can learn more about the specific programs that have led the Aga Khan to this moment and this evening. He was awarded the Scully Prize not only because of his own awards program, which we will learn about, but also because of an interrelated network of programs and initiatives that affect the Muslim world, including an educational component, a historic cities program, economic development, and more. We hope to learn more about all of these, but let us say that they put what contemporary governments might do to shame. To achieve these goals, the museum has assembled a thoughtful small gathering on stage, and it will engage in a discussion. We're going to attempt to make this the grandest public space in Washington, as intimate as possible, and have a frank and open conversation. Even though we're all admirers, we will not whitewash, because he wouldn't want us to, nor would we. We'll steer our discussions toward reality and the realities of the world. So to begin, we'll learn more about the Aga Khan Award for Architecture and the programs that it engages, which is now fully described in a video that we'll see.
The Aga Khan Award for Architecture was founded in 1977 to focus attention on the architectural achievements of Islamic societies. The award seeks out excellence and heightens awareness of the rich and varied Islamic architectural tradition. It celebrates a broad range of achievements, from social housing and community improvement to reuse, conservation, and contemporary design. The award is part of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture that focuses on the physical, social, cultural, and economic revitalization of communities in the Muslim world. To qualify, projects must be designed for or used by Muslim communities. They must also have been completed within the past 12 years and have been in use for a minimum of 1 year prior to entry. Up to $500,000, the world's largest architectural prize, is awarded to projects selected by an independent master jury appointed for each triennial cycle. The 9-member jury is chosen by the award steering committee, chaired by the Aga Khan. The steering committee also set the criteria and thematic direction of each award cycle. Because of the broad range of issues and locations involved, professionals from all backgrounds and religions are appointed to the jury. It chooses a shortlist from several hundred submissions. On-site reviewers then visit these projects, returning to present their findings at a final meeting. This is when the winning projects are selected. Issues raised by the awards generate enormous debate amongst the jury and beyond. Ultimately, it is this vigorous discourse that is the key purpose of the awards. This is extended beyond the jury rooms to publications and sponsored seminars that in turn stimulate thought-provoking ideas about architecture in the wider world. The first cycle of the awards in 1980 established themes of social responsibility and sustainability. Controversy followed when an award was made to a self-help community planning program, the Kampung Improvement Program in Jakarta, Indonesia. Prior to this, spontaneous building was largely considered to be outside of the realm of architecture. But with the first award, the architectural community was encouraged to reappraise its definition of architecture. Over the past 8 award cycles, there has been a concern to encourage sustainable building types that provide solutions for new or improved housing. The Grameen Bank housing program in Bangladesh is an example of how a community can be empowered by very modest means. As well as social schemes, excellence in private housing has also been recognized. The Salinger residence in Malaysia is hand-built using traditional skills, yet has a strikingly modern presence. The awards have a long-standing tradition of rewarding conservation. Many cities have a wonderful heritage that has disintegrated. With the right approach and skills, entire towns can be brought back to life. Awards were made in 1995 for the conservation of Old Sana'a, Yemen. and for the conservation of Mostar Old Town in Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1986. Juries have recognized the social and cultural importance of historic monuments and awarded projects that restore such buildings. The Great Omari Mosque in Lebanon dates from the late 13th century. The 1989 jury saw its reconstruction as a beacon in a tortured land. The restoration of the 14th century tomb of Shah Rukn-e Alam in Pakistan is one of many projects that have seen the rediscovery of long-lost crafts and skills. Contemporary pressures on the built environment mean many old structures can no longer be used for their original purpose. The awards have therefore encouraged imaginative, adaptive reuse of buildings. This building in Qatar was once a ruined palace, but is now the National Museum. In 2001, an award was given to a scheme called New Life for Old Structures in locations throughout Iran. Here, the country's unique built heritage was preserved through the adaptive use of private and public spaces. The question of how to regenerate urban areas has been an important consideration for the awards. Solutions include the Great Mosque of Riyadh and Old City Centre redevelopment in Saudi Arabia, that won an award in 1995 for reinterpreting styles of the past to create a meaningful dialogue with the present. Other approaches include innovative landscaping schemes like Baghi Ferdowsi Park on the outskirts of Tehran. The context of buildings is important, whether in relation to the setting in which they are built or the use to which they are put. The 1998 jury commended the design of the Lepers Hospital in Kopdar Taluka, India, for creating an attractive and friendly sheltering enclave within a barren and hostile environment. In extreme contrast is the 5-star Datai Hotel, built in the rainforest of Langkawi, Malaysia. The award in 2001 was given in recognition of its outstanding environmental sensitivity. The Aga Khan Awards have promoted examples of architecture where the construction technology has seemed wholly appropriate. The Hajj terminal in Riyadh was designed to house the 1 million or more pilgrims who make their way to Mecca every year. This prompted the design of the largest roof in the world. The 1983 jury called the design brilliant and imaginative. In 1980, these elegant water towers in Kuwait City were awarded for the ways in which they integrated modern technology, aesthetic values, functional needs, and social facilities in a public space. Throughout its 25-year history, the award has celebrated outstanding excellence in contemporary architecture. Examples include Vidhan Bhavan, the striking State Assembly building in Bhopal, India, designed by architect Charles Correa and awarded in 1998. And the National Assembly building in Dhaka, Bangladesh, designed by Louis Kahn. Awarded in 1989, the building is now widely regarded as a masterpiece. As a recognition of lifetime achievements, the Special Chairman's Award was established. There have been just 3 recipients since 1980. The first was to Hassan Fatih, an Egyptian architect, artist and poet, in acknowledgement of his lifelong commitment to architecture. Iraqi architect Rifat Chadirji was presented with the Chairman's Award in 1986 for his work in synthesizing elements of contextual architecture with key principles of 20th century design. In the last cycle, the Chairman's Award went to the Sri Lankan architect Geoffrey Bawa. His striking use of interior and exterior space put him amongst the great international architects. Despite these many areas of recognition, the award is still searching for exemplary solutions to certain building types. These include affordable mass housing, hospitals, work environments, and industrial spaces. As the search for excellence continues, the jury of the 9th cycle of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture has selected a diverse range of building types from different parts of the world. In the 24-year tradition of the awards, the jury has chosen 7 agenda-setting projects that provide yet more inspiring and thought-provoking solutions to the compelling questions in architecture today.
And now it is my pleasure to present His Highness the Aga Khan.
Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin my comments this evening by thanking the National Building Museum for the occasion of this seminar. I would also like to thank Professor Scully particularly warmly for having used this occasion to pay compliments to the work that I have done in the past years. I have taken an example from your book. People have often asked me why I created this award for architecture. And I think the video has shown you some of the examples of the issues that have faced people in the developing world, and particularly in the Islamic world, as their physical environment changes. I was concerned that much of the building that was taking place in the Islamic world had lost its sense of direction. There was a hiatus in cultural continuity. There was a lack of clarity and precision in the educational institutions that were forming the young architects of the future. I profoundly believed that architecture is not just about building, it is a means of improving people's quality of life. At its best, it should mirror the plurality of cultural traditions and the diverse needs of communities, both urban and rural. At the same time, it must employ modern technologies to help fulfill desirable aspirations for the future. In Islam, the Holy Quran says that man is God's noblest creation, to whom he has entrusted the stewardship of all that is on earth. Each generation must leave for its successors a wholesome and sustainable social and physical environment. For these reasons, I began in 1977 working with leading architects, philosophers, artists, teachers, historians, and thinkers from all religious faiths to examine issues in the built environment and to establish an award for architecture. The task was extremely difficult, and some thought impossible. We sought to reshape and reposition knowledge and taste, and to change the behavior of those who have an impact on the built environment. That meant not just architects and their clients, but governments, planners, granting organizations, village organizations, educational institutions, and builders, large and small, in urban and in rural areas. If we could achieve this, there was a real chance we could launch a process that would become self-sustaining to help bring about the truly profound change that we sought. That led us on a long journey of inquiry and action, based upon a premise which, strangely enough, was never put formally in writing. We were interested in architectural achievement, not just in design, but how good design could help improve the daily lives of the users and beneficiaries. It was from this service perspective that the award parameters grew. One example was the definition of architecture. The users were largely in developing countries, so we pushed our definition far beyond the so-called architected buildings and into self-built environments, many of them in rural areas, most of them poor. It was from this notion of service to people that we were led to search for best practices. We sought examples of best practice for vastly different local situations, from the ultra-poor in rural environments to the ultra-rich cities and towns of oil-producing states. The solutions we found ranged from restoration of historic buildings to the new high-tech buildings of modern societies. The criteria for best practice varied to reflect conditions. Poor communities, for example, do not have the resources to replace buildings every few decades. So we looked to best practice that emphasized efficient and creative refurbishing, or to new construction designed for a much longer economic service life than in industrialized countries. As the inquiry process became more widely known in the communities where we were focused, they responded to us with two basic requests. First, teach us how to do things differently. And second, show us examples of best practices in real-world situations. In response, a number of parallel programs were spawned to teach these best practices, such as the Program for Islamic Architecture at Harvard and MIT, and the online ArchNet resource, which supports global dialogue and research. We were challenged with finding ways of making these best practices available to broad segments of the population in order to have a continuous and positive impact. In the developed world, that would mean reaching the middle classes. In the developing world, it meant making these best practices accessible to the poor. We have had some success in this regard through our Historic City Support Program, which we launched to develop best practice models in the real world. That program has been applied in some of the poorest settlements, many of them in rural areas. We have shown how human and material resources can be applied to deteriorated and underused cultural assets. The result has been new economic activity and a better quality of life. So I am pleased that 28 years later, we have had some success in achieving our original goals. We are gratified that so many others are now engaged in the cause. We have created a momentum that has become a self-sustaining and unstoppable force for change in the human habitat of the Muslim world. And I am most pleased the principles we have established are having an impact in much of the developed world as well. But there is still much to be done. Quality housing remains the most essential need for societies everywhere, both in rural and urban environments. Industrial facilities and workplaces are not at a level of excellence that makes them exceptional. Rapidly expanding urban centers throughout the world lack public parks and open urban spaces. Problems of transport, congestion, and pollution have too few solutions emerging. The growth of slums, the consequence of the relentless forces of urbanization, has not stopped or even slowed down. And although many fine examples of rural projects have been represented in past award cycles, still there are not enough. I am also concerned that there is still too little attention being paid to design for communities to protect residents from the effects of earthquakes, many of them in remote rural areas. 2 million people died as a result of earthquakes in the last century, and 100 million were severely affected. There are vast populations that live in seismic-sensitive high mountain areas where we must focus attention. And the massive devastation of the Indian Ocean's tsunami has taught us a terrible lesson that the destructive power of earthquakes can reach far beyond the initial disturbance. It will no doubt lead to new thinking and new approaches towards seaside construction. So we are by no means at the end of our task. To quote Churchill, we may be at the end of the beginning. I hope next quarter century of the award will contain as much innovation and surprise as the first. To the extent that it does, it will be thanks to the many hundreds of capable individuals who have given so generously and continue to give of their time, their knowledge, and their talent. To all of them, I am enormously grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Highness. We'll now hear from an architect who is seated on the panel and who happened to speak last night. His name is Charles Correa, and as a measure of his interest in this program and of the Aga Khan work, he flew from India to join us in these proceedings over these days. He is an Indian architect who is internationally known. He's a planner, he's an activist. I first heard Charles, as many architects have, in public forums in a darkened room somewhere in the United States. I have no idea when that occurred or where, but I remember being mesmerized by a man who sat there with uncommon common sense. He seemed to be able to take problems that existed in everyday life in India and translate them into poetic structures, not a small accomplishment. And he continues to do that today, not only in housing, for which he became extremely well known. Low-cost shelter for the third world became something of, he wrote and articulated about in 1985 in a book called The New Landscape. He's been awarded most major prizes, including the Aga Khan Award for Architecture in 1988, the Premium Imperiale, the International Union of Architects Gold Medal, and Reba's Gold Medal. Ladies and gentlemen, a man of uncommon common sense and poetry, Charles Correa.
Thank you, Robert. Well, good evening, friends and the Aga Khan. I think at the outset I want to try to establish something, is that, and it's this, that the award, the Aga Khan Awards in architecture are not something in another box very far away from the world in which we live. let's say for me in India, it's very, very easy to relate to the issues. What are the issues which we were talking about, which His Highness just spoke about? It is architecture as design, architecture as development, architecture is as identity. Architecture is not neutral. It's not even politically neutral. You know, you quoted Churchill. Churchill said something else. I hate to quote Churchill, but I must say this. He said, I don't know how we are quoting Churchill, but anyway, maybe it's the Rome that makes us quote Churchill. Anyway, he said, we build our buildings and then our buildings build us. Well, that's a profound statement. We have to be careful of what we build because it's going to affect the people who live in it. Now that's something I can relate to in India. It comes really the central concern, I would think, of the awards. I think it's something which you in America can relate to. Aren't you concerned about what's happening to your environment? If I jump back to an architect like Frank Lloyd Wright, whom of course Professor Scully has written much about, it's amazing what Wright did. He faced exactly the same issue. How do you invent the way Americans are going to live for a whole century? Whenever I go to Chicago, I go to Oak Park, and if ever I saw a brave new world, it's Oak Park. It's a whole century ahead of a young country and young self-made millionaires, and Wright showed them the way. That's what this award is about. He built buildings which built Americans differently than they were built by Stanford White, who made them like Europeans. No, he made them Americans the way Whitman made American poetry. It's not such an unusual challenge. It's not just something, an exotic challenge which the Islamic world, poor things, face. It's a challenge which we all face. And that's what I think is important about this award. And that's why I think I can relate to it, and I think any architect or any human being relates to it. Now, how did the award get involved in these questions? And I think here there are two things. First of all, I think right from the beginning, for some reason, Your Highness, you insisted that it should be not for a lifetime's work, but for individual buildings. And yesterday we discussed this a bit. That was a profound decision. And it's what makes it different from all the other major awards, which are given in a more, what should I say, it's a more generic, you can just say this is a very wonderful architect and he deserves this gold medal. Now in this award, you have to look at the building, you have to know why you are giving it this award. You have to ask questions about it. What are the issues? Exactly. So in asking those questions, it's exactly what Wright, what Frank Lloyd Wright, what Louis Sullivan and all went through. You question what you build. You question why you think it's valuable. And I think this is why this award continues to grow in stature, and will continue to grow. And I think now, although it doesn't really apply to the, it doesn't address built structures in the West so much, I don't think any building in the Western Hemisphere has been awarded, except in Paris. There was, of course, what am I saying? There was the Arabs, the world, the Monde Arabe in Paris. They have been buildings. But in spite of that, I think it has tremendous relevance to this, to the issues, because of the parallel it has. Now, anyway, in trying to find these issues, the award then had to learn what people who lived in these parts of the world were concerned about. And this is when a whole series of seminars started, which took on a life of their own. And again, I think what is unusual about this award, and it's very much thanks to His Highness, that whenever you're thinking about something, a possibility opens up like a door at the other end of the room, and you don't know if you've got the courage to walk through that door, because you know you're going to find, like Alice in Wonderland, another door room with another door, you know. And that's how I think this grew, because there was the how do you say, the courage and the integrity to know that if we have to go there, we go there. So through these seminars, which was remarkable, it started in the late 70s and the 80s and still goes on, a whole lot of people in different parts of the world starting with the Islamic world, but now it's spread elsewhere, would meet and discuss what they thought concerned them. And these were all people who were doers. These were not, they were architects, but there were lots of other people who were social workers, social scientists. And the issues which came up, as His Highness just said, were quite staggering. People were concerned not only with architecture and the metaphysics of building, but also with issues of urbanization, issues of squatter housing. These are very big issues. And the award had to decide, is it going to go into that room, into that area? Because when you go into these fields, you will find that the problem of housing is huge and intense, but the solutions, the perfect solutions, do not yet exist. What exists is what I think Luke Kahn used to call the first axe. It was someone who understood an axe is a stick with a sharp edge, and it doesn't have to be just a stone. There's a lever arm. So the award realized that we have to look at, how do I put it? It's like you can reward the finest fruit from the top of the tree, but you can also realize the importance of new roots, which one day will bear fruit. Now that's very remarkable and that's how the award could proceed into all the squatter settlement, resettlement programs, etc. And it's very unusual for a major award to stick its neck out, I mean, to go where no award has dared to go, kind of thing. And none of them do it. They play it very safe. But we realize that, again, with the absolute encouragement and energy of His Highness, we went into these areas. And when I say we, I meant a whole series of steering committees and master juries which have involved, as he said, hundreds of people right across our profession. And I think to that extent, it has changed our profession. It has had a big influence, I think, on that. And so I was going to say that really, in a way, the whole experience, and to the extent I participated in it, was really a journey into darkness. You had to have the enormous faith that it was going to work. And I'm so happy and proud that, for His Highness's sake, that it has worked, that in less than 3 decades, all this has been accomplished in the field of the built environment, and also yesterday, as we heard from Vincent, in the field of human development. Thank you, Your Highness.
And now we transform this Klieg-lit stage in front of all of you into a more intimate setting in which we're going to engage in conversation. And I think to add to this conversation, we have another member of our panel, Martin Filler. You know, facts are everywhere today. Data's cheap. Opinions are a dime a dozen, but an informed opinion is worth any price. And Martin Filler provides the world with informed opinions. He is an architecture critic par excellence who will tell us what he thinks. He has done that for the New Republic, for House and Garden, for 20 years, and he's also contributed to the New York Review of Books regularly. You may have been to a museum show that he has guest curated, seen a film he has made, or heard one of his lectures. He's one of 3 living Americans in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences as an architecture critic. Martin, welcome.
Thank you.
Your Highness, Charles. We have things not to solve, but to explore here this evening. And Your Highness, I must begin with you. Rarely would we have a chance to chat in public like this. You eloquently described many of your programs and your hopes, but we find ourselves in a period, I think internationally, where government is retreating from the social sphere. In this country, that is true. We've seen it in Russia as well. Large countries, small countries. And there's been a return to sort of the individual, the rational individual, as someone who can manage their own affairs and their own lives. You represent a large religious community. scattered throughout the world. And I'm interested in your perspective on how architecture can work, how your programs can interact through a program that is non-governmental. What is the interrelationship, if you will, of this large and vast network of programs that you have and government today?
I'm not sure that there's an interrelationship with government as a government. I think the interrelationship is with the entities of civil society. And I think it's the entities of civil society which are going to be the carriers of change in the years ahead. In fact, this program is attempting to invest in the carriers of civil society. It's in education, it's in community organizations, it's in financing agencies. It's affecting the pillars of civil society, I think, which will become the anchors of change.
So, rather than relying on your own abilities, you are transforming communities and aspects within communities worldwide. Yes. And those changes are then broadening out.
Yes, we're trying to assist organizations of civil society to set new standards, to look at cultural history, to look at proper use of resources, to look at what people are looking for from their buildings. Because you made the point yourself that the ultimate validation of a building is the way in which it is used and appreciated by its users.
We find ourselves, Vince Scully mentioned that we're in a perilous moment in the world. We've had natural disaster, political turmoil, we find ourselves at war. It's a moment that's fraught with great danger, in a sense, and a very serious one. And yet we're looking at architecture, we're examining architecture. We've just emerged from the emergency in India. Well, just informationally, is your organization engaged? These are communities that you serve. In what ways and how?
We're engaged in a number of situations. We're engaged in post-conflict situations, such as in Afghanistan. We're engaged in situations where directed economies are becoming liberalized economies. We're engaged in new development capacity, particularly in areas such as microcredit, so that we're engaged in a number of areas which are impacting the quality of life and the way change occurs. And we're looking at countries in the developing world which are exploring new forms of government. But exploring new forms of government alone could be a perilous exercise. And that's where there is such necessity to build human capacity to underwrite the processes of change. And that's what I mean by civil society.
I see. With the awards themselves, let's broaden this to the group now and talk about the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. I think we're all here are admirers of the program. That is a given. But is it possible to characterize these projects as collectively? And I throw this to the group, Charles, Martin, as well as Your Highness. Is it possible to characterize these as a group? They seem remarkably disparate in scale, scope, type. Charles, what's your opinion of them as
well, I think
a collection?
I would think that's actually a virtue, because it is a pluralistic world we live in. Architecture addresses many things, technology, it addresses history, but it addresses aspirations, you know. And people have different aspirations, and I think they have, and you get a great variety of architectural projects, of planning, of housing, and I think that's very good that we don't have a kind of approved style. I mean, obviously, you wouldn't want to do that.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
In thinking about that, I think as a journalist, there's here this group that is quite varied in its scale and scope. Martin, from your perspective as a journalist writing about and thinking about these projects, I'd be interested in your perspective on them as a group. What strikes you about the program or the group of projects?
Well, I think it's the very diversity of the awards that I find so encouraging. Alfred Barr, the founding director of the Museum of Modern Art, once said that if 10% of the works he picked for the permanent collection of the museum stood the test of time, he was ahead of the game. And I must say, looking back over almost 3 decades of the Icon Architecture Award, the percentage is vastly superior to that. Inevitably, any critic will look at any year's prizes and say, well, how could they have given it to that and not to this one? Mm-hmm. Quite frankly, I think in the last cycle, there were some of us who felt we could really not see perhaps the justification for the Petronas Towers, what this particularly has to do with Islamic architecture. Be that as it may, even if one looks at a very well-known cultural award such as the Nobel Prize in Literature, you look over a century of awards and you think more in terms of who was missing from that list than who was included in it. The other thing that I think is so extraordinary about the awards, and I think it's a parallel with the Icon's own very strong personal belief of avoiding a cult of personality around himself, is that this is an award not going to star international architects, but to projects honoring, in many cases, patrons, the architects, of course, the communities who represent them. And I think this is running counter to a cultural phenomenon of out-of-control international celebrity. I've written very caustically about my opinions about the Pritzker Prize, by far the most celebrated of the architecture awards, which to me seems to be confirming the obvious in many cases. And it's quite interesting to me that in the late 1970s, just at about the point the Icon Award was being founded, the Pritzker gave its very first award to the man who they said we must give it to because we must establish credibility for this award. Unless we give it to this man, no one will believe we're serious. And it turned out to be Philip Johnson, peace be his soul. And I think looking back now, that seems rather shocking, given the subsequent history of architecture. So I think, in a way, it might be easier for lazy journalists to publicize star or celebrity architects. The dumbing down of architectural discourse, the soundbite, the quick news image feeds into that. It's not easy to summarize the accomplishments of this award, but once one has a few 100 words extra in your column, I think it's quite easy to explain it.
Well, it is interesting, though, because every I almost reverse the terms, every project has a story. And they're not chosen simply for their formal characteristics, which most awards programs recognize, which often are based on rather superficial or quick takes by a jury. There's this triennial 3-year very careful appraisal, but it seems that everyone has a story. And I'm interested, Your Highness, in your own interaction with the juries and how actively you are engaged. I've heard you talk about this, but I think they'd like to know how much or little do you know about what is going on as these as these stories are unfolding and over a 3-year period.
Well, let me get back first of all to why the award has got such a variety of projects which it looks at. When the award was founded, the question was asked, what are the processes of change? And who is being affected by the processes of change? And the decision was taken, I think correctly, to say that the award wanted to cover the widest spectrum of processes of change in the developing world. And the processes of change are not restricted to the wealthy. They're not restricted to architect-built buildings. They're not restricted to urban environments. The majority of the population in many of these countries is rural. And therefore, we took the decision that if the award wanted to impact the processes of change, then it had to have the opportunity and the ability to make decisions on all these different levels of activity. And this was a decision that was taken after considerable discussion. And I hope and believe time will show that it has been correct. With regard to my own involvement, yes, I'm involved, but the jury is totally independent. The relationship between the steering committee and the jury is a very interesting one, because the steering committee has a 3-year mandate. The jury comes in every 3 years and looks at what's happening. And this interrelationship between the continuum of involvement of the steering committee and the one-time analysis of the jury keeps the award very much up to date and on its feet. So in a sense, I'm involved with the steering committee. I'm involved with, obviously, knowing who the jury members are. But I'm told about their decisions at the same time as everybody else, for good or less good.
For good or ill. This year there were 7 winners, and just to reprise for the group, they included the Grand Library at Alexandria in Egypt, which is a bold new building, very contemporary, very strong, powerful, formal, and also theoretical. A primary school in Gondo, which was a modest school that I think sort of caught people's imaginations with its own formal story and its human story. A sandbag shelter prototype building that could be built in a number of locales. Restoration of a mosque, revitalization of the old city of Jerusalem, a very powerful house for 2 brothers in Turkey, and the Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur. This is about as diverse a group, you say pluralistic, this defines that in architectural terms, let us say. Charles, among those, is there a particular project among those that you think summarizes ideas that you have, understandings that you've seen over the years with this program?
Well, luckily I wasn't on the jury this
Yes,
year, so I don't have to justify what they did. But I'd like to ask you a question, Robert.
Yes.
You know, the point I was trying to make, that what's important about this award is how relevant it is to so many societies around the world, including this one right here, etc. And I'd like you to comment on that, if I may ask you, and Martin too. I mean, supposing we had the equivalent in America that I think just now, AJ, you said, I forgot exactly what you said. You said different levels of...
I think the switch went off.
Is it on?
Yep.
You said there were different levels, income levels, and... Check this out. Hello.
I think it's on.
Hello? No.
It's on.
There it is.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, sorry. Now I forgot what I was saying. Anyway, I
The
think
relevance for our society, this
the
is where
relevance
you
for
were
your
going. Yeah.
society, and you have different income groups, you've got different lifestyles, and some of them have wonderful ideas, but they get lost in the shuffle because of all the whole media, the superstar thing. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you had someone here in this country, or in this society, or we had someone in India? And there are people here, of course, there are the MacArthur Awards, which I suppose do throw a big net and find the best people. It seems to me that we all need this. We all need to understand the nature of change, the vital role of architecture as an agent of change, as a catalyst, because it touches on all these things. It's much more than just, it's much more than the brick and the mortar we see. It's the passion, and it's all the implications, the culture, etc. I would think that's what I find interesting about the award. It's not something that's happening in a kind of Disneyland, which is exotic and worth watching and commenting on. It's something which can passionately connect with where we live. And I would like you, or Martin, if I'm exaggerating, or whether you feel this sense on that.
I think that part of the attraction for me personally, you ask, you're turning the tables here on the moderator, and that's okay. But is that, yes, I knew, for instance, about several of these projects. In fact, they had been published in the pages of our magazine. We had written extensively about the Library of Alexandria and the Petronas Towers, for instance. However, I had never seen the primary school in Gondo, Burkina Faso, nor met the architect who had designed that school. And I happen to be from the poorest state in the United States by birth, Mississippi, which faces if not analogous situations, but there are very strong challenges there. And I saw what this individual faced, and I was moved by it, but also informed and encouraged in the sense that real architecture could change someone's life in a small town. That's a basic and fundamental story. The challenge there, I think, is the tree falling in the forest. And that is the Aga Khan Awards now through their, how many years is this, Your Highness? Is this
28?
28.
If I'm not wrong.
Have built up a reputation that does attract media attention. But the communication of the ideas is part of the challenge. It isn't merely that the award is excellent, it's how are those ideas conveyed and how are they perceived. Martin, I don't know.
Well, the other thing that I think is important to stress about the Aga Khan Awards is that they do not look at architecture as an isolated aesthetic phenomenon.
That's true.
Not only are the awards given very diversely to contemporary design, to urban planning, to historic preservation, but they're part of the larger Aga Khan network in which architecture, as it correctly should, for all of those who believe in the sociological approach to architecture of Lewis Mumford, that it should be part of an economic, political, and social fabric of society. And I think one of the things that makes so much contemporary architecture so shallow is that it is focused so thinly on style. And yes, there has been a breakdown of the great architectural patrons of the past. The state is no longer doing that, except perhaps in France when you get a president with a money de bâtir. But you know, the great patrons of the Renaissance, of the Baroque period, of neoclassicism do not exist in the same way, to say nothing with what you were mentioning about the retreat of the state worldwide from social issues. So I think by seeing and promoting the idea of architecture as something integrated into larger social developments, that you can't have architecture without education, you can't have education without healthcare, you can't have healthcare without architecture, it becomes a unified sense of architecture, and therefore the works that emerge from that point of view, I think, are more resonant. Yes, we want beauty, we want things that are attractive and are aesthetically pleasing, but not to have that as the final goal of architecture.
Your Highness, in a previous conversation, you mentioned in your initial foray into the world of design and the design process, and that it led you, and I think still leads you, as an observer, into inquiry. You seem to be always asking questions yourself. What are the questions you are asking today? What are the questions we should be asking today? What are the relevant questions that continue to confront you and that you confront others with?
Right. I think from the awards point of view, the inquiry processes have not been able to cover all categories of building. And that in itself is a source of concern. Let's keep in mind that the economies of these countries are changing. As they change, more and more development, physical development, will occur under private initiative, corporate initiative, single initiative. And I am concerned that those processes of change should be analyzed and validated so that workplaces become places of quality. That's not the case at the present time. So industrial buildings, commercial buildings are categories, types of buildings which we, I think, need to do a lot more work on. Public space. There's enormous pressure in these cities on public space. And yet, it seems to me that by tradition, the Islamic world has premiated public space. It's been an area of real importance, and I would like to see more of that occurring. So I think that in looking to the future, there are two areas of concern. One is a critical mass of knowledge of good buildings in rural environments, for example, so that we can say 10, 15, 20 years from now, we understand the processes of change in the rural environment, and we have enough information to share with rural communities so that we can help them improve those processes of change. And then, of course, there's the economic issue of industry, commercial buildings, and housing, frankly. Housing infill is a major problem in our part of the world.
I want to take those up separately and distinctly, perhaps in a moment. Let's just take the issue of housing, for instance. Charles, you face in India, for instance, a burgeoning population that will soon be the world's largest. What is the role of architecture and how is it addressing sort of this immense growth that is occurring right under your nose?
You know, it's a huge problem. I don't think it's an architectural one necessarily, though architects are absolutely part of the solution. I mean, we have to bring such skills as we have of organizing space or layouts, what have you. But the reason we have such a terrible shortage of housing in the third world is that with the distressed migration from the villages, and this goes for Rio de Janeiro, for Brazil, it goes for Indonesia, for India, etc. Although we knew that the populations, the urban populations would grow, we did not increase the supply of urban land. So people became squatters. And so the solution is very much has to do, goes way beyond designing a house for someone. In fact, I always feel it's kind of insulting, you know, like if there's a famine in India and then I run around writing cookbooks telling people this is how you know, it implies they're starving because they don't know how to cook. They're starving because it's a game in which I'm on the winning side and they're on the losing side. And that's true of housing too. So it seems to me that if you really want to do something about housing, and that's what we're trying to do even in Bombay, you've got to increase the supply of urban land on a scale commensurate with, and we're trying to do that with a big mill land in the center of the city, which is being changed. Now, when I say urban land, it's land which has jobs or access to public transport. People are coming to the cities not for housing, they've got houses, but they're coming for jobs. And where those jobs are located, how you generate them, how you tie them back. You know, in a city like Bombay, which I think you saw, it's a long linear thing, you've got the railway systems which go up, they're really going up north. But people started to live around the railway stations. And that's how Bombay still works. People can jump on a train and go up and down. It's like Bogota. Now, if you subsidize the train, you are indirectly subsidizing housing. You understand? You make the housing affordable. So it's things like that that open up land. So architects are part of this, of these. We should all help with the solution. But the real thing is this business of opening up the structures of our cities. We've been very lazy about that. We, you know, here in this country, this sentence of "Go West, young man" is the most politically profound statement of all, because it really says, don't hang around this place, use space as a resource. And we haven't done that enough. That's why you get squatters in these cities, in Rio de Janeiro.
But this gets to one of those fundamental questions about housing and gets back to the program in a sense, because housing, we know, confronts the contemporary civilization at the economic, the social, as well as the areas that directly affect architecture, planning, and so forth. The program engages a number of those things that you've described. For instance, job creation, I would assume, through Historic Cities program. Could you comment on that? How you see this interplay affecting, ultimately, something as discrete as architecture?
Right. Well, I would start by saying that I still think there's a significant disequilibrium between quality of life in rural environments in many of these countries and the perceived quality of life of urban environments. And unless there's a better equilibrium which is built into the development processes, we're not going to see urbanization slow. And I don't think it can be stopped, but I think it can be slowed by better balancing between the two environments. The second thing is that the historic cities traditionally have been transit spaces for newly urbanized populations. And therefore, they are very often the very poor coming from the countryside, going through historic spaces that are degraded by the process of changing hands every 2, 3, 4 years. And I think what we found is that if you invest in those cultural spaces, you can actually turn them into economic generators. And when you turn them into economic generators, you stabilize the population that is in them, and you stabilize the value of the cultural asset. Now that does sometimes mean you have to reutilize the cultural asset for different purposes, and that's sometimes sensitive. But certainly in areas like Cairo, and I think now Baghi Babur in Kabul, we are finding that we can, through investment in these cultural environments, bring a totally new economic context to, in the case of Cairo, 200,000 people. Baghi Babur, it probably will be even more. So these cultural liabilities become cultural assets and economic assets if you invest in them. The most well-known of these situations, I think, was Mostar. And Mostar was the case study situation, which taught everybody else that you actually can convert these cultural liabilities into cultural assets. Now, it's quantifiable. That's what's interesting about it. It's not that you can't measure the improvements in longevity, access to education, disposable incomes, and all those issues.
Martin, this is not the way we normally talk about architecture.
Well, more's the pity.
Yeah.
I was very pleased this summer to have attended the rededication of the Mostar Bridge, in which the Akan Foundation, along with World Bank and World Heritage, helped restore the famous 16th century bridge, the marvel of pre-modern span masonry engineering. What interested me as a journalist to go there, because the very oversimplified story is the bridge symbolizes the rapprochement of Muslim and Christian in this war-torn section, and it was almost a cartoon-like oversimplification things. When you go there, you see still the terrible social divisions that exist there, that this is not a quick and easy fix, that it's going to take many, many years of concerted economic development. The mere fact that there was such a mass migration of the populations there during the war to all parts of the world, to Scandinavia, to Texas in the United States, a large Mostar community. People who will probably never return there. Who will replace those people? What will be the industries that will replace the light industries that were the major source of employment were destroyed? These are many things that tend not to get covered in the general press coverage. I mean, when we're talking about the oversimplification of architectural criticism, you just look at the kind of newspaper coverage of the aftermath of the war and Mostar itself. What was wonderful, though, was to see the painstaking quality with which the restoration around the bridge took place. What the Akan Foundation did wasn't just to do the bridge, which in fact I think was largely an effort of World Bank, which, by the way, departed from its traditional format of doing dams and other kinds of infrastructure, and deemed this, thanks to Jim Wolfenson, a special case. It was restoration, but it was also a bridge, so they could get it in under that rubric. But to see what was being done in the areas around the bridge, where the historic structures, which will become restaurants, shops, employers, to help revitalize tourism, coaches that come now on day trips from the Dalmatian coast with tourists now will be encouraged to stay overnight to pour some more money back into the local economy. And this isn't a solution for revitalizing the entire town, but the fact that the Akan Foundation is looking at the whole context, and by the way, restoring those historic, if not architecturally masterful buildings in the immediate environment with the care and the precision that they would a masterpiece of Islamic architecture.
All that gets to another point that you raised earlier, and that is that the level of contemporary debate and discussion, in fact the other awards programs, tend to focus on relatively simplistic ideas. Style, for instance, which seems to be the word in coinage right now. There's even been a book written called The Substance of Style, in which style has its own value and its own validity. Yet these awards clearly, as you've demonstrated, engage something deeper. Charles, what is the relevance of a word like style in say, East Asia or in Asia? What place does that rather ephemeral sounding word have in a place where needs are great and populations are changing?
No, I think to design or to create something elegant is a reward in itself. I mean, just because people are poor, they don't have to lead ugly lives. In fact, the irony is that some of the poorest societies in the world produce the most beautiful handicrafts, as you know. Mexico right next to you, Nepal, India, other places. No, I think I don't think they live with ugly things. I think in spite of their, they do very well. So I think there is style there. I think what I was saying about housing, I just like to return to that, is that I was talking about squatters. When it comes to housing for people who can afford, let's say, a 3 or 4 story building, which means brick and stuff. I'm not talking about a huge building. That's really the middle class. And I'm very happy to see that all over the third world, including the Islamic world, there's a lot of effort made by architects to deal with housing. And that's gone out of some of the West, certainly gone out of America, out of North America. And that's a great shame, I think, Robert. The whole modern movement, as you know, was fueled by the issue of housing. Everybody, whether it was Corbusier, whether it was the futurists, what have you, and it gave the energy. Now, so first of all, there was an idealistic. Now today, really the most important buildings are museums and airports. These are 2 buildings which are totally culture-free. They are greenfield buildings. They are unconnected with society. Housing is something developers do and you despise it. That's very sad. When you design housing, it seems to me when you design and I'm not against museums and airports. I think it's wonderful. But we must recognize it's like producing a beautiful word. It exists in isolation. Housing is connecting words, because housing means syntax. It's a completely different process. It's the ability to connect things, and therefore it informs the rest of your work. In your office, if you're doing some housing, it's going to change the way you design that museum. It's going to, and the other way around too. So I think it's very sad that practices of architecture, which have this big range, have gradually become very much about this one-off special object, it seems to be, and that has a huge implication in this part of the world, but not in India, not in most of the Muslim world, not in China, where people in schools of architecture, they teach a lot of courses about housing. But it's really what I would call middle-class housing. It's housing which people can afford, really walk-up apartments and stuff like that.
So housing is an area that's ripe for the awards focus.
Yes, very much so.
And other areas that you want to see covered or premiated through this process?
Housing, certainly. Workplaces. Industrial buildings. I think commercial buildings, office buildings, is an area that we will need to be looking at also.
Your Highness, I wonder if I could add one, and that is something which might call urban coherence or urban form. What I find dismaying about India and about much of the world is that our cities are getting uglier and uglier, and people adapt to that. They don't seem to notice, and that's really scary, because people are learning to live with very ugly things. Buildings are built meaninglessly, and we have to build up some sort of, coherent way of relating those words. of language, yes.
And speaking of language, there are a number of words that form a sort of lexicon that surround this program that I've plucked here and there from a number of the publications that surround it and the conversations that we've had. Pluralism is one, context is another, the disparity of urban and rural cultures is another. Your Highness, what about this word pluralism? This seems to mean a great deal to you and something that you care very much about and that you discuss. Could you talk to us about what that particular word means to you in the context of architecture?
Yes. Well, I think the nature of the Muslim world is pluralist. It's pluralist in terms of its civilization, it's pluralist in terms of its languages, it's pluralist in terms of its physical environment. And it seems to me that the cultures that have developed in the history of the Islamic world are cultures that deserve to be respected and not washed aside by some normatizing process. And therefore, keeping value to historical continuity is an issue which the award, I think, has felt was important. And therefore, this notion of pluralism is really a notion of respect for cultural identities in a pluralist form. And that's the notion of pluralism in this environment.
And it's played out in the very diversity of the choices that we saw on the screen tonight and that have been celebrated in the awards themselves. Another word is context. That seems to be a word that arises. It's been obviously in coinage and favor for a decade, but here, context, what does context mean to you today?
Well, it's interesting to me that at the time the award was founded in the late 1970s was a sort of high watermark of this idea of contextualism that was rising up in reaction against the hegemony of the international style, which was imposing a very bland, universal approach to architecture in all kinds of places without regard for local building traditions and even worse, local environmental conditions, where I think a real complaint could be made. And there are fashions, we're talking about styles in architecture, but there are fashions in architecture as well. And the pendulum has swung in recent years away from the idea of contextualism, which often could get very literal in terms of
vernacular.
You know, the worst kind of toy town vernacular architecture. Now swinging completely away from that towards the dominance of theory in the architecture schools and in architectural practice, which in general I would characterize as an imposition of certain intellectual constructs that completely ignore the artifact, that completely ignore the object and the visual aspects of the art form. I would hate to see some of the very important affirmations of context that the award defined in its early years, certainly with awards such as the Masters Awards, particularly to Hassan Fatih and to Jeffrey Bawa, and to move in another direction. I know there's always the fear we want the award to keep up with the times, we want it to reflect current developments, we want to encourage younger architects to submit and to make their work available to us. But I think that idea of context, especially in the Islamic world, where there are very, very sound reasons for the way building forms emerged, very practical, very environmentally intelligent, and sustainable ecologically, that would be disastrous if they were lost if the pendulum goes too far in the opposite direction.
Let me bring one final question to the group because the hour is drawing on. And this is a word that is much reviled in contemporary discussion, and the word is beauty. It's one that's whispered among lovers, perhaps. But I think it has formed a component of Islamic architecture. I'm interested in the group's perspective of that word. You said it's an important part of the life of regular people. So. What is its place in contemporary society, this word?
Well, that I don't know, but let's say in the architect's life, it's very, very important. It's what motivates you to design.
Yeah.
But in that process, you realize that there are other issues involved of development, etc. But you certainly would like to do something which is which is very elegant, very beautiful, and there's so many examples of it. I think Hassan Fathi's work is a great example where just using mud, he made things of absolutely, ephemeral beauty, just the most beautiful things.
Your Highness, what works of Islamic architecture move you? What do you love?
That's a difficult question to answer, but there are many buildings and many public spaces which I find very, very powerful. And it's today the absence of public spaces in the Islamic world is something of major concern to me. And Charles, you were talking about city planning. I think we are, generally speaking in the Islamic world, still very weak on landscape architecture, urban planning. We still need to do a lot more there. A number of architectural schools actually are linked to schools of engineering. And that in itself tends to bring a form of architecture which may not necessarily be what we would be looking for. I'm not criticizing that, but I'm saying what used to be a great strength in Islamic design seems to have disappeared. And one of the issues that we're trying to develop now is to restore value to these traditional forms, and keeping in mind that these materials and these forms are not without meaning. In many, many cases, they're symbols. Symbols of interpretation of the faith, symbols of viewing of the future, and so on and so forth. So I think it's very important that this notion of beauty should be respected and developed. Now, taste changes. So I think we have to be careful not to try to take the sense of taste of the past and stick it on an airport or stick it on a modern building. I mean, I think we have to live in our time and live in the future also. And that's why the award has been very careful, and in fact the master juries have watched this, never to ignore modern building. In all the award cycles that I can recollect, there has always been a modern building which has been premiated, dealing with modern issues.
Well, with that final remark, I think the panel has concluded its work for the evening. Thank you both. Thank you, Your Highness. And Mr. Wren, the evening goes back to you.
Your Highness, thank you again for honoring us with your presence and your wisdom. It's been a wonderful evening for all of us. Mr. Filler, Mr. Correa, Mr. Ivey, thank you for such an engaging dialogue. It was really quite wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank all of you for joining us here this evening for this extraordinary program. Now, this does conclude our evening's program, but I would ask you for your cooperation, and please remain seated while His Highness departs the National Building Museum. Thank you for being here. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.